Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock. I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 249, Remembering Nicholas Utechin.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, do you remember Nicutecan?
I do remember Nicutecan. I remember him very, very fondly. And I'm delighted that we're going to have an opportunity to talk about Nick and about his many great contributions to the world of Sherlock Holmes today.
Yeah, it is. It's unfortunate that back in August of this year, Nick passed away at the age of 70, leaving a great hole in the Sherlockian universe. His contributions to the literature of the subject, shall we say, were profound. And I think it will be quite some time before we see another of his ilk.
Well, you may be right, but I think that there's a lot also that we want to celebrate in terms of thinking about Nick. And there's a lot that can be learned in talking about his approach to life and his approach to Sherlockian scholarship and just his energy. You know, he's one of these people whose loss is made even more tragic by the fact that he was so vibrant and alive and so full of the moment every time you had the opportunity to talk with him. And I suppose that's some of the things we'll get into today.
Absolutely. So we'll just pause here for quick station identification. Of course, this is I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. You can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/ihose249. My goodness, this is the 249th show. That means our big 250th celebration is coming up in the very next episode, so you'll want to stay tuned for that. Now, we do have an occasion for you to celebrate with us as a Patreon supporter. We offer additional content and ad-free versions of the show on Patreon. So for as little as $1 a month, you can become a Patreon supporter of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Just go to patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock or follow the Patreon link in our show notes. Of course, in our show notes, you can also find your way to other places on the Sherlockian web, whether it's to our sponsors or to some of the books that we may mention in this episode, and of course, previous episodes that are naturally going to come up because both Nicutecan and our guest, Steve Rothman, have been on the show before, and you may want to go back and listen to their episodes. Steve Rothman has edited the Baker Street Journal since 2000, and he holds the 2 Schilling Award. He writes and talks about the works of Christopher Morley, and he edited the Standard Doyle Company, Christopher Morley on Sherlock Holmes, as well as A Remarkable Mixture, award-winning articles from the Baker Street Journal. He co-edited with Nicholas Utechin, the former editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal, To Keep the Memory Green, Reflections of the Life of Richard Lancelyn Green, 1953 to 2004. Steve delivered the 2008 Cameron Hollier Memorial Lecture to the Friends of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection of the Toronto Public Library. A dedicated book collector since the age of 12, he's also president, apparently for life, of the Philobiblon Club of Philadelphia, as was Dr. Rosenbach before him. Steve Rothman, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
And for those folks who may have forgotten or who may not have heard the other episodes, you were with us first on Episode 8, all the way back at Episode 8 in Season 1, back in 1997. And as a matter of fact, you were on with Nicutecan for that episode. And then you joined us again for Episode 76, where you talked about Out of the Abyss with Bob Katz and Andy Solberg. It was the BSI Press publication there from I think it was the Empty House manuscript. And then most recently, you were on famed episode 221, talking about the Baker Street Journal. So glad to have you back, although it is with bittersweet news that we invite you back this time to reflect on the life and Sherlockian or Holmesian works of Nicutecan. So I'm going to switch this up a little bit. You know, in every episode, we ask our guest how they first met Sherlock Holmes. Well, I want to understand how you first had an acquaintance with Nicutecan.
First knew his name from reading the ancient Shades of Sherlock, which was a cyclo-styled zine, we'd call it nowadays, put out by youths. The young Christopher Redman, the young Andy Peck, the young S.E.B. Dallinger, etc., and Bruce Kennedy. And I was just a subscriber. Nick was a contributor, and I think I first saw his name there in 1968. So that's when I first noticed his name, and then I started seeing it in the Baker Street Journal. I wasn't subscribing to the Sherlock Holmes Journal in those days. And, but I think we may have corresponded once or twice over the years. But what happened was when I became editor of the Baker Street Journal, I decided I should have some sort of correspondence with editors of other journals, particularly that of the Sherlock Holmes Journal. So I emailed Nick, he emailed back, and we did some back and forth, and it was polite and possible, and we began a friendship this way. And then when Richard Lancelyn Green died in, when was that? 2004. We did a lot of course. There was a lot of emails flying everywhere about Richard and Richard's death, and Nick and I got together, and he came up with the idea, or at least first articulated the idea, that we should do some sort of festschrift for Richard. And I got the lucky job of selling this to Mike Whalen, and we came up with the idea of doing a international imprint, the Quartering Press, which we shared with the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, and who was the co-publisher on this. And Nick and I co-edited the book, and it was lots of fun working with Nick. It was horrible having to do this about Richard, who was a good friend of both of ours. And that's really, after that, it really grew, because we got in the habit of emailing each other quite often, and Nick would write to me in the morning, because he wasn't the earliest riser, and I'm up 5:30 or 6 every morning, so that's 11 at the latest in Oxford. And so I would respond, and so it would go throughout the day. And sometimes a week or so might go by without us writing, but basically we had email all the time. But I didn't actually get to meet the man until 2004, after Richard's death, when I went to, well, my mother calls it the world's longest Shiva call. I went to see Richard's sister Scylla, who lived in a different suburb of Oxford, and Janice and I were there, and Nick came over, and we had dinner with Nick and Scylla and her husband, and that was really the first time. And then I didn't meet him again until several years later, when he finally came for the first time to a Baker Street Journal dinner after having been an irregular for over 30 years.
Wait, he had never been to a BSI dinner before?
Nope. Julian gave him his shilling, but he had never been to one. I think he got a shilling in 75. I might be wrong about that, but I believe, 73. He got a shilling in 73, just turned 23.
Wow.
And so, but he never got to go till then. He'd been in America a good bit. His father was teaching at Penn State and then at Stanford. And after his parents divorced, he would often come and visit his father in Penn State. But he hadn't been to America. He met various Sherlockians, including ones that he had worked with on Shades of Sherlock, and made his travels around. But the dinner was a first time, so I have stories about that.
Oh, well, we'd love to hear some of those stories. Nick, for our listeners, Nick was a very unusual, even among the unusual cadre of people who were interested in Sherlock Holmes. He was unusual because of his very early start. You just mentioned he was inducted into the Baker Street Irregulars when he was quite young, but even younger, in 1966, he was inducted into the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, and I think he was something like 16 at the time, wasn't he?
Yes, he was just 16, and he even contributed to the Sherlock Holmes Journal for the first time in 1966 with a letter. So, yes, he was very young when he joined the society. Some had joined it younger. I didn't get around for several years because it seemed expensive to me. So, yes, he knew he wanted to be a Sherlockian. His middle name was Rathbone, because his grandfather was a first or second cousin of Basil's.
Really?
Yes. His mother's maiden name was Rathbone.
That is, I never knew that. All the years I knew Nick, I never realized that connection there. Well, it was clearly written in the stars and written in blood. Well, so Nick had this very young introduction and induction into these storied societies. When did he first take the helm as editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal?
76.
76. So he and that was a post he held for how long?
30 years. 30 years.
30 years.
Wow. Wow, that's unparalleled in our little hobby.
It is. I mean, there might be somebody who's done a small science publication for that long or longer. Doesn't have the heft, whatever it is, of the Sherlock Holmes Journal. And it was amazing. By the end, he decided it had certainly been long enough.
Yeah, and
I remember when he was writing to me about it.
And I'm interested in that thought process, Steve, because you've been the editor of the Baker Street Journal since 2000. You've obviously seen your share of editing fun and woes in all of that. What was his mindset behind the "it's been long enough"? Was he seeing too little in terms of variety of scholarship? Was he looking to do other things? What was he thinking about?
I think he was a little tired of it and probably looking to do other things. Also, I think he was being pushed to do a little bit more of the actual sort of editing stuff on his computer, and he never was real comfortable with doing some of that. He never learned how to center a word on the page or something else. It was a matter of hitting space over and over and over again. I can tell you this, I've looked at enough of his manuscripts. And I think it was just becoming a little bit of A, a nuisance, B, life had changed, and he was just looking to hopefully find something else.
Oh, that's fair. And it gave him an opportunity to contribute to the literature on the subject in other ways, not just as an editor, but as an author as well.
Absolutely. And I have a list that Nick made of his home museum, as he puts it, writings, of which there are over 620 some. And you can see that by the end of 2006, when he left his editing chair, including his various book reviews and editorials and things like this for the Sherlock Holmes Journal, he had done 412 things. So in the next 25 years, he did another third, so half again as much as he had done in the previous 40 years. So
wow.
He was a very, very busy boy.
Well, that's indicative of Nick. You know, he had a great style and a great approach, and even from his very earliest days, he was desperately curious. And there was never, in my experience of Nick, there was never much of a gap between his curiosity and action. he would just jump into things.
You'd get an email saying, so I'm thinking about blah, blah, blah. What do you know? And because Nick could Google as well as the rest of us, he always seemed to be happy to have me be his researcher. And I knew sometimes when he was throwing out a leading question to me that he really just wanted me to look something up. And I would. I'd fall for it every single time. And happily would come back an hour or two later with this and this and this and this and say, do this, Nick. Here it is. Look this up. You know, and since I had done the really hardest part of the work in setting him off, then he did the even harder part of the work in reading the stuff and digesting it and coming up with something. And it worked well, and we would work together this way a lot.
As you think across his list of contributions, where do you think his strength really lies? You know, aside from the research element that you just talked about, as a writer or as an editor, where were his superpowers?
His superpowers, I think, were realizing places, often obvious places, but places where others hadn't really thought so much about who has been written about or who's been talked about. Like his last piece, his final piece, which was on J. Finley Christ. He started sort of wondering about it and collecting some of Christ's little things, some of which are done on horrible, horrible paper and are falling apart as you look at them. And then he started wondering just how many of these things are there and, you know, who was J. Finley Christ, and really looking into it and he found wonderful things and discovered, you know, all this stuff and gave us this long list of publications. I think he's certainly changed my thoughts about Christ's work, because up till then I mostly thought of him as the man who came up with, in my mind, the very annoying 4-letter abbreviations for the stories. But now I think of him as a very serious scholar and a very funny one.
Yeah, and in some ways, a Pied Piper of the Sherlockian movement early on.
Yep.
And that I was particularly struck by that entry in the Baker Street Journal because I received my copy of the journal, maybe a week or so before Nick passed away, and was just marveling at it because it is almost, it's a very lengthy article, and it is almost long enough to have been considered a candidate for a Christmas annual, I would think.
Had Nick not gotten ill, I would have pushed him to keep expanding it. As it was, he sent it to me a few weeks after he got his diagnosis in December and said, see what you can do. And I did. And then we were playing with it back and forth, and he pushed me quite rightly to make sure that it was in the spring issue or summer issue, whatever it was, so that he could see it. And I can tell you that he did. He held a copy of the journal in his hands, and because I flew one out to him, and Annie, his wife, wasn't sure whether he truly appreciated what it was, but he held it in his hands, and she read it to him over the next several days, and it made him very happy.
That's excellent. Well, I want to get back to, in a minute, I'd like to get back to some of the stories that you mentioned you had about dinners and Nick, but just to sort of continue the conversation about his writing and about what made him, one of the many things that made Nick Utechin special. When you look at his papers, his body of work, one of the things that really is unique is about the range of subjects and the deft way he handled each one. In the Sherlockian world, you have people who become fascinated with a couple of characters. They become fascinated with a couple of events or scenes. They become interested in the Royal Navy. They become interested in 221B. But Nick was interested in everything. And so when you look at his work, you find essays about the location of 221B based on an analysis of the placement of the street lamps. You find an assessment of Professor Moriarty, a couple of assessments of Professor Moriarty based on various categories. You find his thoughts about was Holmes grieving for Irene, and did that affect his behavior in a couple of the later cases? We on our podcasts have reviewed his work about The Politician, The Lighthouse, and The Trained Cormorant, and his linking of that to actual historical events about anthrax in Scotland. And Watson, he would also step back and say, what is it about these stories that are so compelling and grabbing? And what are the different methods that Watson uses to get us into each case? And he wrote about that. What stands out in your conversations with him? What's your sense of all of that?
I think you're absolutely right, Bert. All sorts of things would grab his attention. Sometimes we would be talking about things. After one of the first of the recent mass shootings, he got very upset. Nick was a very, very, very liberal guy. And he got very upset about this and said, why are you so crazy in your country? And I said, well, look, it's the Constitution. Not how I would read this Constitution, but it's how the Supreme Court reads the Constitution. So this is how it is, and you kind of have to live with it unless we could pass and change the amendments, and it's not going to happen in the current state. But then he wrote a book about, he wrote an article about the use of weaponry in the canon and how Holmes would have been entirely opposed to guns and things like this. So he would just do this if he felt it was necessary. And sometimes I would say to him, no, this is not going to make some people happy. And I don't care. This is how they should think. Because Nick was a I think I already said this, a forthright guy. Nick never hid his feelings about things. Yes, here we are. Capital cases, Sherlock Holmes, guns, and capital punishment. But,
yeah, you seldom had to ask Nick. So, Nick, what do you think?
He volunteered on his first dinner, first time in New York for the dinner. We went out on Thursday night with a group of Sherlockian friends, one of whom was Jerry Watts, the late Jerry Watts. Jerry was the loveliest man, as you both remember. Kind, sweet, really cared about his friends, really cared about people. He was also a fierce libertarian, a strong supporter of the Libertarian Party, gave them endless money and things like this. How this jived with being a physician, I don't know. And, Jerry would often want to get in arguments with me about this, and I would say to him, I love you, Jerry. We're not going to talk about this. I'll want to slap you. But, so I warned Nick before we went out to dinner. I said, Jerry's a lovely man. You cannot talk to him about anything having to do with politics. Ha ha ha! Did I make a mistake? So Jerry is on one side of Nick. I'm on the other side of Nick. And we're at a large round table. And I can hear after a point that somehow they're talking about government medicine practice, socialized medicine, if you will. And they're going on. And Nick, who, like many British men and women of his generation, and even now, the National Health Service is a religion. It's not just a practice. And he was going on and on about it. And Jerry is going on. And I am, after a while, because it's getting louder and louder and taking over the whole conversation, so I slam my fist into Nick's thigh. He turns to me, he said, why'd you do that? I said, I told you not to talk politics. He said, right. And goes right back to it. I slam him again. He said, wait, why are you doing that? Stop that. It hurts. And so on. And he didn't stop. And neither one won. And I'm not surprised. But this is how it is. After Mr. Trump was elected president, he said, how could this happen? He said, look at the numbers. I said, we have something called the Electoral College. And this is what decides. It's not the people who decide. He said, really? I said, look at the Constitution. He said, oh, coming back to me. I see. That's stupid. I said, yep.
Oh, yeah. And I'll bet even after that exchange, Nick and Jerry were still quite chummy and shoulder to shoulder in terms of Sherlockians together.
Absolutely. They loved Sherlockians. They loved Sherlock Holmes. And they were both lovely, lovely people. And they had very different politics. And
yeah.
Well, but that's just so indicative of Nick, because he's always struck me as one of these people whose curiosity, which manifested itself in Sherlockian things, must have been a characteristic of him ever since he was 1 or 2 years old, or just verbal, because he seemed to have built a world and a very strong personal moral platform about how things should be. And he was one of these people that if you tell him, I don't want you to talk about that, what he would hear is, I challenge you to talk about it. And he would say, okay, yes, exactly. I'd be happy to talk about that.
And he was a very verbal person. I think words were all of it. I would be surprised if he actually came out of the womb talking. And this is why his final illness was so cruel, because it was a glioblastoma, which is a brain cancer, and one of the effects it has is taking away your ability to speak properly at first and then really speak almost at all. And so he lost his words, which is, I can't imagine anything crueler to happen to the man.
Yeah, if fate has any irony, I think that's what's going to happen to Bert and me someday. Now, Nick, I remember Steve, I remember corresponding with you about Nick after his diagnosis. And at one point, you had mentioned that he was going through his library and, as you put it, saying goodbye to old friends. What did you mean by that?
He was rereading all sorts of books. He would say to Annie, look for, say, Baring Gould's Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street or something. Tried to describe what it looked like and where it was. And he wasn't always able to say what he wanted. And so it was hard for her, but, and he would be frustrated because he couldn't find it or do it. But she would find the books, and then he would read that book, and then he would go to another. His wife and his son both told me sort of that they were jealous in a way of Sherlock Holmes because he was taking so much of Nick's time this winter and early spring, because this is what he was going back to more than anything else. He was just spending his time reading what he wrote, what others wrote, just going over and over the things and trying his best to understand, I suppose, and know what was Sherlockian. It was very interesting to see, but I guess it was the thing that was in many ways, most beloved outside of his family, and the most beloved inanimate object, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know he cared deeply about his family, and it's bittersweet, isn't it, that he basically was given this terminal diagnosis, knowing that there was a finite amount of time that was left of this world for him, as there is for all of us. The difference is many of us don't know, in general terms, when our expiration date is, if I can put it bluntly. He knew he had a set number of months left to live, and he decided what he needed to do with his time during that period. So I don't think, for anyone who knew Nick, who loved research, who loved reading, who loved talking, I don't think it's any surprise that he would have surrounded himself thusly.
Absolutely right.
Now, this may be going a little bit outside of your sphere of knowledge. Maybe it's not. We'll test it out. The other thing that was important to Nick that he truly identified with down to his core was Oxford. And he was the consummate defender of Sherlock Holmes, went to Oxford. And he had this lovely house in Oxford, Highfield Farmhouse, I believe, one of those houses that has a name. What can you tell us about his association with Oxford and with his home?
Well, Nick's father, I'm just going to say it's Sergei, because I can't do proper Russian pronunciation. Nick's father had managed to escape Stalin's Russia and ended up in Oxford 30s or during the war, and was a scholar. So Nick grew up in Oxford, was born in Oxford. His grandfather had gone to University College, Oxford, on his mother's side. His mother had gone to one of the colleges in Oxford. And so this is where he was actually educated up till the equivalent of high school, at which point his father had a post up in Glasgow, and he was there, but he returned to Oxford and pretty much lived there for the rest of his life. There were times in London and things got early in his marriage, but he was in Oxford. He was proud of being in Oxford. He was delighted even knowing that the nursing home where he spent his last month was the one that had been built on the grounds where his primary school had been in Oxford. And he was proud of getting the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine against COVID because it was the Oxford vaccine. If you visited him, and many Americans visited him, he would happily take you on a tour of Oxford that was an excellent tour. And since he was an MA Oxon, had entrance to all the colleges, and we could march through them, he would just wave the little card, and it was a lovely thing, and would show all his sights. And I would share stories about things where he was wrong, but but he loved Oxford. Truly, it was like a member of his family, and that we brought this up would make him happy. So
now,
well done, Scott.
If memory serves correctly, I believe Young Sherlock Holmes was filmed partly at Oxford. Was Nick involved in that at all?
I don't think so. I'm not positive. He was consulted on a number of various things. Like, I know at one point the people who were doing the Morse things consulted him, and he did various things about Sherlock Holmes in Oxford. Well, when the Sherlock Holmes Society of London did one of their weekends in Oxford, he was very involved in the planning. And this is the only one of their trips that he had ever been on. But he did that. He did a reissue and revision of his Christmas annual about Knox for that visit, which was also done then, yet again, as the third volume in one of the Baker Street Regulars books, limited edition sets, which meant I had to read this thing 3 times through and see it through publication. That's love for you. But yeah, he loved the place.
The MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories is the world's largest collection of new traditional Sherlock Holmes stories, with all author royalties going to the Undershaw School for Children with Learning Disabilities. And as of the end of June 2022, these authors have raised over $100,000 for Undershaw. That donation, which continues to rise, has been gifted from the royalties of all of the stories coming from the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories. The deep partnership between Undershaw and MX Publishing has spanned a number of years and has witnessed many changes. Undershaw, of course, was the house built for Arthur Conan Doyle in order to accommodate his wife's health requirements, and it's where he lived with his family from 1897 to 1907. While he was there, he would have worked on The Return of Sherlock Holmes and The Hound of the Baskervilles. And that continues now with the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, now up to part 23, under the capable editorial guide of David Markham. Congratulations to our friends at MX Publishing on reaching the $100,000 mark in their support of Undershaw. As you continue to show interest in the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, MX Publishing will continue to be able to support Undershaw and all that it offers, those beacons of the future. Check out the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories at mxpublishing.com.
So, Steven, what are if somebody were to ask you to like me, to tell them your favorite Nicutecan story, what comes to mind? What do you think really sort of distills the experience of talking and working with Nick?
Well, we've talked about his endless energy and doing things. On the other hand, he was could be very stubborn about some things. When he was working on the Knox publication, and he wanted information, I would say to him, Nick, you live in Oxford. One of the greatest libraries in the entire world is 20 minutes from your door. All you have to do is go to the Bodleian. They have the books. They have what you want. I don't like to use the Bodleian. I said, you have to use Bodleian. No. And he wanted to, for the Knox thing, he wanted to do and did a variorum edition of the early publications of Knox's essay. But one of the earliest publications was in Blackfriars Magazine. Now, Blackfriars Magazine is put out by the Dominicans. So I said, well, the Dominicans have not a college, but a house in Oxford. I said, I bet they have the magazine. Why don't you go there? Because he was refusing to go to London. He was refusing to go to the Bodley. And yes, he went there, and he was a happy boy. But I had to push him sometimes in the silliest ways to do things. other times it would be just endless energy, and words would be pouring forth. We would talk about something one day, and a week later I'd get 2,000 words about this, and asking what I thought about what he had written. And he did little publications about his family, and he did little things about all sorts of things for the society. He was just a busy man, but he would sometimes just refuse for reasons he didn't like using the Bodleian. I guess this is a result of something as an undergraduate. But
it was run by libertarians.
Possibly.
Oh, no, librarians. I'm sorry. I got that wrong.
Oh.
That's interesting, though. I wonder what he objected to about the Bodleian. It must have been something administrative, you know?
Well, they are slow, and you do have to wait for your books. On the other hand, it's the Bodleian, for crying out loud.
Exactly.
If I lived in Oxford, I'd be there all the time.
I said, if I was M.A. Oxon, I would basically just set up tent.
Yeah.
Exactly. Holy cow. Well, and this is interesting because to me it's indicative of what we talked about earlier with respect to Nick's personality. Very strong-willed, very strong opinions. And Steve, I have to wonder, working with Nick in an editorial capacity, when he was authoring something for you and you were the editor, he's been an editor. He's got very strong opinions about the topics that he's working on. He can certainly pump out a lot of words. What kind of subject was he like in terms of managing his work from an editorial perspective?
Mostly it went very, very well, Scott. Sometimes he would object to my changing his spelling, and I said, "It's an American magazine. Sorry, Nick. Your U's are gone. Your S's are out of here. There's Z's. There's no U's." And to my American punctuation, but he understood. Ultimately, he kind of felt the one thing we never got to a meeting of the minds over was the use of the Oxford comma. I believe in the Oxford comma. I think it's necessary for understanding, but I know that it hasn't been in the UK for, say, since after the war. But Nick was brought up not to use it and opposed it vigorously. And so...
I think I figured it out. I think I figured it out. I mean, it seems ironic that a guy from Oxford would not like the Oxford comma, but I think the guidelines and rules of the Bodleian Library were written with Oxford commas.
No, actually, what you're missing is that in the UK, it's called the Cambridge comma.
Had it been, I would have understood entirely.
Right.
It wouldn't have surprised me. But no, really, we worked together very well. And when we did co-edit something, say, the book on Richard Lancelyn Green, we divvied up the different essays, and then we would both work on the others afterwards. Nick's approach to editing was sort of slash and burn. He would march through a manuscript, and just whole pages would go, or paragraphs would go. And I would just get something that would just be largely marked out. And mine is a much more surgical, as both of you know, since I've known you both, mine is a much more surgical approach and slower and methodical, taking a word here or a phrase there and trying my best to mold something else. But we worked together really well, and it worked, and I think to both our delights. And so I'm happy to say that. And
that's lovely. When you think about the totality of Nick's work, Steve, if you had to pick one that you would read again and again to your delight, Is there any one particular title that comes to mind?
Maybe the Paget book that he did. Possibly the Milvertonians. The Milvertonians was a wonderful thing because there he took something that was largely unknown. Some of us had some of those pamphlets around and we knew that they existed, but Nick was able to dig this out and find this stuff, and it was great, and I was really happy with what he was able to find. And it took, there again, it was another one of these things with pushing, and a few leads had to go unfollowed because the people who were around weren't willing to help us enough. But what can you do? But that and the Christmas annual that he did with Matthias on the Baker Street sitting room show was wonderful. I found so much stuff, and you almost had a feeling that you had visited the fair and you understood the agonies that were gone through to set this thing up and dealing with the horrors that were Adrian Conan Doyle.
Yeah, we should tell our listeners that some of the things we're referring to here, the Milvertonians of Hampstead were a UK science society that had flourished and then faded away. But Nick, through the research and so on, produced a book that preserved their history, that preserved their writings, and told the story of the Scion, which was fascinating. And the Paget portfolio, of course, is the collection of virtually all of Sidney Paget's illustrations, using original art wherever possible, brought together in one portfolio. And the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual was all about the great exhibition, 221B exhibition that began in the UK in the 1950s, that kicked off a resurgence of interest in Sherlock Holmes, and that involved a recreation of the sitting room of 221B. So those are some of the major literary things that Nick produced.
Yeah, this is why we keep Bert around, you see.
Well, I thought it was just because he's ornamental. That mustache.
Well, there's many reasons. It varies on any given day. Steve, as you think about all of the things that were swirling around in Nick's head and Nick's project plans, is there anything or things that you wished he were able to get to before he passed on?
Not sure, because poor Nick, right before the pandemic, had a cataract removed from one eye, and then, because of the pandemic, was unable to get the second cataract removed until towards the end of last year, 2020. And so was going around monocular for all those months, just having one eye that he could sort of see out of, the other, just with one lens pushed out of his eye and a patch over the other, and had to be a mess. So he wasn't doing as much of the work as he might have hoped to have been doing or thinking about. And I'm not sure. I know that he must have had other plans, but and possibly I will mine through our correspondence to see if I can ever figure out what they were and throw them at some other energetic person. Scott.
Well, that's, and I am not grasping at that brass ring by any chance, but that leads to an obvious follow-up question. Who do you think is the natural heir to this level of activity and curiosity and content generation that Nick Utechin left us with?
There are probably several people. Ira Matetsky has certainly put out some wonderful things that are more from his interests, which are largely royally, but he's discovering things in copyright and publications that I, as an old bibliographer, find fascinating. Mark Jones is digging into Conan Doyle in marvelous ways, and his podcast is probably rivaling your own. I know I'm not supposed to say that here, but it's, after all, a different sort of subject since he's entirely on Doyle more than on Sherlock. And I'm always being surprised with who could come up with what. Mark Alberstadt, the editor of the Canadian Holmes, has been pushing out wonderful articles on Conan Doyle and sports, something that was very near and dear to Nick's heart, the sports part.
Mm-hmm.
He could never understand the fact that I have no interest in anything played with a ball, and just shook his head. And yet he also couldn't understand why I understood the rules of cricket, which is largely because Philadelphia is the most serious cricket-playing city in North America.
Now, Nick had some cricket memorabilia of interest, if I recall correctly, as part of his collection.
Well, no. I think what you're remembering is that Nick was very instrumental in having Conan Doyle's cricket bat, which had been in Lausanne in Switzerland, is part of the Conan Doyle chalet, repaired and then placed in the Cricket Museum at Lord's in London.
Right.
And so he had been approached about it and did all this sort of research and then helped raise the money for the repair and make the connections so that it's now proudly displayed at the museum, because it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to exist, but it was completely broken, shattered bat, and now it's looks used but glorious. Who would know you could repair a cricket bat or a baseball bat, I suppose?
Beautifully restored. Now I remember what I wanted to ask you. You know, one of the things we haven't mentioned in this discussion, which I think would be of interest to our listeners, is what Nick did professionally. You know, we focused very appropriately on the world of Sherlock Holmes, but our listeners might ask, well, gee, so what did this guy do from 9 to 5?
This guy did from 9 to 5, or probably more often from 5 to 11 or something like this. This guy was with the BBC for most of his career. He started with Oxford Broadcasting Company, Oxford Radio, but was in London with the BBC as a writer, a producer, a broadcaster at times, though mostly he was behind the microphone, and you would just hear this voice at the end saying, and produced by Nicutecan. I can't do a radio voice, but this is what he did, and I know he was considered very, very good at what he did, and held in high esteem by his colleagues at the BBC. And if you've heard any of his recordings in connection with any of the Sherlock stuff, because he produced and introduced a number of the Sherlockian radio recordings and things like this, you'll hear Nick's voice, which was a wonderful radio voice, and lively and entertaining, and with an oomph to it to get it across like you guys, not like mine. And so,
and you know, I'll never forget the irony after having Nick on, I think it was that episode 155 where he talked about the Paget portfolio. When afterward he asked if we could send him a CD recording of the show, which showed you exactly how unfamiliar he was with computers.
Mm-hmm. When I visited Nick, I was looking at his computer. He said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "Well, Nick, the way you always are talking about it, I thought it had to be steam powered."
Oh, that's funny. Steampunk Nick. Well, I'm conscious of the time here, and I'm certainly aware that you could probably go on talking about Nick for as long as anyone would let you. What closing thoughts can you share with us, Steve?
When Nick got his diagnosis, he asked me to make sure that I continued to write to him, even if he wasn't writing back. And I did. I kept that promise every day, and I wrote to him. And in the last month, since he's dead, I have this gap in my life in that I'm not writing to him, and I wish I could.
Well, Steve Rothman from the Baker Street Journal, longtime professional colleague and friend of Nicutecan, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Bert.
Someone who's active in the world of Sherlock Holmes for so many years, as Nicutecan was, and someone who is so unique, is not easy to capture in 45 minutes or so of conversation. But it was great to make a start anyway at doing that. And I imagine that in the weeks and months ahead, there'll be more opportunities, more publications, more events, more options for looking back at Nick and his contributions.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, he is one of the giants of the Sherlockian and Holmesian world, and we're lucky to have had him with us for as long as we did, and for him to have left such an impact on us. I thought it might be worthwhile, too, to just grab this paragraph of brief biography from the back page, or the back cover, I should say, of the complete Paget portfolio from our friends at Gasogene Books and Wessex Press. According to his bio, Nicholas Utechin joined the Sherlock Holmes Society of London in 1966, was invested in the Baker Street Irregulars in 1975, and began a 30-year editorship of the Sherlock Holmes Journal the following year. He also rejoices in being a master Copper-beech-smith of the Sons of the Copper-beeches. He worked in radio broadcasting as a producer and presenter, primarily for the BBC, specializing in live news and current affairs programming. Now retired, he lives in Oxford in Great Britain with his wife Annie, and enjoys being surprised by the careers of their two sons and the antics of their two grandchildren.
Arthur Conan Doyle wrote 22 novels. The one he thought his best is an adventure story of knights and chivalry. 20-year-old Alan Edrickson travels the world, encountering bullies, con artists, thieves, a damsel in distress, and two men who become his closest friends. Together they join the White Company, archers and fighters led by the gallant Sir Nigel Loring. Will our hero win the hand of Loring's romantic daughter Maud? Will the chivalrous Prince Edward restore Peter of Castile to his Spanish throne? Published in 1891 and never out of print, The White Company is a tale of pageantry and piracy, heraldry and hope, published now in an exclusive, annotated edition with the original N.C. Wyeth illustrations in blazing color. Don't you owe it to yourself to read Conan Doyle's favorite book? Get the annotated White Company at wessexpress.com.
Well, it's the time for everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right, it's time for Canonical Couplets, where we give you two lines of poetry, and we ask you to discern which Sherlock Holmes story we are talking about, because God knows we don't know. If you were around here the last time, you may recall we gave you this clue. A voyage round the world. It seemed a poor excuse. The slinking, furtive figure had become a sad recluse. Bert, over to you to unwind this conundrum?
Oh, it's easy. That refers to the mysterious visitor in a lodging house that's owned by a mean old burglar. That's the case Watson called The Adventure of the Jailed Codger.
I would like to give you credit for that. But
I'll take it.
I fear that would be encouraging you. And I don't know if that's the right message to send. Well, fortunately, our pal Eric Deckers has come to the rescue. He says, I've solved it. It's the story of Godfrey Emsworth's seeming disappearance from his best friend's life as he undergoes some significant personal development. It's the story called, Are You There, Godfrey? It's Me, Margaret. Wait, I might be confusing that with another story, he writes. It's more likely the adventure of the Blanched Soldier. And yes, Eric, that is exactly right. Our sad recluse was Godfrey Emsworth in The Blanched Soldier. Well, let's see who else was smart enough to join Eric in his discernment there. And from among them all, we will pick a winner by spinning the big prize wheel. And it's going around and landing on number 37. Number 37. And it looks like that is Alicia Shea. Hey, Alicia, glad to have you back in these parts. We have a prize from the iHose vaults that we will send your way. It'll be a surprise, so stay tuned for that. Now, we have, I guess, another opportunity here to pick something out of the iHose vaults, and we thank Tony Katroki for sending in so many prizes for us to use. So thank you, Tony. And now let's get to the clue. 7 in the evening on a lovely summer's day. An exit through Holmes's bedroom. There was evil on the way. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, stick it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. All right.
Excellent.
So 250. That's like a quarter of a millennium.
Well, that's in dog years, yeah. But very few. I imagine our listeners would be surprised to learn this, but relatively very, very few of our listeners are dogs. But
that is true.
We do get a lot of notes from this great gerbil in Sacramento. I must say, I'm always thrilled to get what looks like a text message anyway from. Yeah, I mean, you just have to admire the diligence. Those little hands, those fingers.
I hear you. Well, usually they're running around on their own prize wheel, spinning around. And I thought that's what actually powers the dynamometer here at iHose headquarters. Well, I think there's a lot to celebrate. There's a lot to reflect on. And look, if you folks have comments for us or greetings or suggestions or whatever it might be, get it in before we record the next show. We will give you a deadline of September. No, gosh, it is the end of September. October 14th. If you have any comments for us about our 250th show or ideas as to what we might talk about or cover in the future, please send it our way at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. You can also leave it in a comment directly on the show notes at ihose.co/ihose249, which is the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere site. But it's going to be fun. I think the last time, Bert, we did a celebratory show was when we reached our 100th show, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. So what do we get each other to mark the 250th anniversary?
250. Well, 25 is silver. Gold is 50.
Yeah, this is our semi-quincentennial, you know.
I think I'm going to need 250 oxygen. Something to help me breathe and make it to the next episode.
Oh, I like that. That's excellent. Yeah. We need to take some Langerton.
Yeah, folks, if you haven't listened to our Trifles episode 300 on Trifles, by the way, another milestone, we celebrated by reviewing an ad from the Baker Street Journal for a questionable pharmaceutical called Langerton, all about rejuvenation. It was a lot of fun. And we've heard from a few people on that respect. So get over to Trifles. Just search for Sherlock Holmes Trifles in your podcast player, or check the show notes here. We'll have a link to that episode as well. Well, Bert, I guess this will wrap up the damage report for episode 249. In the meantime, I remain the completely rejuvenated Scott Monty.
And I'm bailing out the engine room. I'm Bert Wolder.
And together we say, the games afoot.
The games afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.